and welcome to Daily Debrief brought to you by People's Dispatch. I'm Pragya. China and the Arab world recently engaged on a scale not seen before. We discuss implications for the region and beyond on our show today. And on the other end of the world, a summit in Australia that's being seen as Washington's bid to loosen China's hold over trade in the Indo-Pacific. We discuss the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which began meeting in Brisbane on Saturday. Chinese President Xi Jinping visited Saudi Arabia for 3 days to December 9, meeting leaders from across the Arab world. During his visit, the Gulf Cooperation Council and China issued an action plan for strategic dialogue. Jinping met with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman as well. Are there implications for Saudi's long-standing relations with Washington? Are the Gulf states responding to growing doubts about what ensures the region's security and prosperity? We speak to Prabir Purkayastha. Prabir, thanks for joining us on the show. So, a very crucial meeting between China and the Arab world, China and the GCC. Can you tell us why it's happening at this juncture, why it's important?
Well, I think that's a very important question, and also the one-to-one meeting between Saudi Arabian MBS, as he is known, the Crown Prince, and President Xi. I think if we put all of it together, it also does indicate that West Asia, or what would be called the Middle East, because it also then includes parts of North Africa, that this area is declaring a independence, I wouldn't say autonomy, from the erstwhile colonial powers, Britain and France, which was later joined by the United States, which took over the leadership of these area countries from that of France and Britain, who were the colonial powers. So given that, I think this is a break that these countries have said, we'll work out our own future. And therefore, when we talk to China or we talk to other countries, we are willing to look at ourselves, not simply as a, ex-France, ex-British colonies, or, under the tutelage of the United States, but as independent countries, we'll work out our own future, and we may have common interest as well as our differences. That also is very clear, that these countries are not homogeneous, they have their own differences. Why is it important? Because this area has a lot of the surplus hydrocarbons, surplus meaning they can export to others. The United States has a lot of it, but the United States is also a big consumer. So it's not a big exporter of hydrocarbons, so they're trying now oil and gas exports, but they don't have that much as export capacity. But this is what these countries have, as have Venezuela, as has Iran, for example, and of course Russia. So if you see that oil is, or energy politics is playing a big role in the world today, then these countries coming together and willing to work out their own equation with China, even if the past equation with the United States is still there, except that they're no longer under the sole hegemony of the United States.
Right.
And it is also true that Saudi Arabia is no longer willing to accept the diktats of the United States regarding increasing or decreasing production, because that's really what matters in OPEC. The oil-producing countries, how much is Saudi Arabia willing to produce more or cut? And then all others seem to follow, because Saudi Arabia is the biggest exporter. Of course, Russia is the next one. So given this and the fact that Russia is sought to be sanctioned, what the oil bloc of countries do is important. And don't forget, outside these oil bloc of countries, if you take the United States out, is Iran, not a friend of the United States, Venezuela, not a friend of the United States, Russia, clear today enemy of the United States. So given all of this, I think the fact that these countries are trying to work out their own equation with China is a very important step in world politics.
Now, China's economic rise is there for the whole world to see in the last decade, especially in the last 5 years. And there's also there's a very big difference in the tone and tenor of the meeting that Biden had in Saudi Arabia compared to Xi's visit to Saudi Arabia. Is this difference going to show the way for the future realignment on a larger scale beyond the region?
I don't think it's a matter of alignments. What they're declaring is independence. And the way they saw Biden, President Biden, he was seen as one who's dictating earlier to Saudi Arabia, deciding who is acceptable, who is not, which of course, given the Khashoggi background and his assassination, it did rub Saudi Arabia wrong. Let's face it.
Right.
Saudi Arabia was behind the assassination of Khashoggi. Now, what the United States was saying is, I decide who I think is okay, who is not. And maybe they were trying to influence a succession in Saudi Arabia, which is what the reaction in Saudi Arabia or MBS's reaction was. And that's why the vibe between Biden and MBS was not great, in spite of the fist bumps. In this case, Saudi Arabia is changing its policy vis-a-vis China and vis-a-vis how it is going to deal with its oil surplus. And therefore, what they're saying is, China is a partner in this just as much as United States is, but we're not going to accept the diktat of either. We are going to work out an independent policy. And I think that's true for now most of the oil producing countries in the region. They don't want an elder brother, a bigger brother, telling them what to do or what not to do. So in that sense, it is a return, if you will, of non-alignment, this time in an area where most of the countries were actually aligned with the United States. And therefore, the possibility of the Belt Road Initiative, therefore the possibility of a larger Eurasian economy, which may not look at Western Europe so much, but look at themselves. And I think that's the larger politics that is developing, and it's really developing on the basis of the economy. What happens in South Asia is something to watch, because we are not linked to the Eurasian continent in the same way. We have the Himalayas in the middle. But nevertheless, India has always had an equation with West Asia. So how does it play its cards now is also an interesting or an important issue. But India has always played a somewhat equivocal balancing role, if you will. We go the United States on the question of China, but we will not go against Russia, old friends. So we'll have to see how they deal with the West Asian narrative that is emerging. And how do they look at non-alignment when you are also aligning with the United States on occasions and you are not. So I think these are all interesting questions to see for the future.
Very much so, Prabir, and thanks very much for joining us. 14 nations from the Indian and Pacific regions are meeting in Brisbane, Australia. The meeting of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework focuses on trade, supply chains, a transition to clean energy, and keeping trade fair. But are there trade benefits for participants from this framework? Reports indicate that the United States and other IPEF countries have agreed to keep negotiating documents under wraps even for years after they conclude. Anish from People's Dispatch has been following the developments. Let's go over to him. Anish, hi, and good to have you back on the show. Anish, the IPEF, the current negotiating round, what are the aims and objectives of this round?
Well, let's begin with this very basic fact that this is one of the most secretive multilateral trade negotiations right now on the face of the earth. There are actual trade documents that will be withheld, including entire parts of the negotiations, to the press, and this is something that is done at the outset of the negotiations itself. And this shows a certain kind of problematic maneuver. I mean, obviously, these things are not uncommon. There have been multilateral negotiations that have happened where discussions and debates and whatever points have been talked about are often withheld to the press, and you only get like a very brief outliner in most cases. But in this case, there is complete blankness and the complete void in information, even though the Australian government has talked about in improving transparency. So that is one thing that we need to always keep in mind when we talk about the IPEF. On top of that, we need to also talk about the big elephant in the room, which is the fact that this entire process is aimed at what they call as supply chain diversification, which is essentially trying to push away China from the global supply chain market, and that is definitely at the heart of this negotiations right now. And the fact that this will be led by the United States, and it will be kind of like the TPP 2.0 has always been a major issue uh, right now in the region, especially considering the fact that there will be aspects of it which will be completely enforced, throughout the region, and that can also have its own implications, politically speaking, in terms of the sovereignty of these nations concerned, and also in how they negotiate trade further with other countries as well.
So, yeah, Anish, I was looking at some government documents and I was also looking at some news reports. They said that the secrecy will last for 5 years after the negotiations are complete. Is that normal? Is that usually how they are kept under wraps?
It is not unusual entirely, but it is problematic in the sense that you will be completely withheld of every kind of information that will be, and this actually prevents consultation to the wider civil society and the public in most of these countries. And where such negotiations, especially when you talk about stuff like some of the pillars that they talk about, which includes labor rights, which includes environmental protections, that which includes data privacy and digital governance. These factors require extensive public consultation, and something of that sort will be completely absent in such negotiations. There will be almost no, talk. Now, the thing is that very similarly, opaque negotiations have happened, but after the negotiations have concluded, very often we do get a large idea of what has been agreed upon, what are the kind of texts that will be pushed through with these trade deals. But in this case, we are not entirely sure of how things are going to move forward. So these factors are definitely going to impact, and now, as I said, like impact the very basic sovereignty of many of these nations, because there will be binding trade agreements that can actually, govern a whole host of issues, and that can also affect one of these member nations' sovereignty to, pursue different kind of relations or even a different kind of framework for their own set of things. Now, one of the reasons why India has opted out of data privacy uh, aspect or the pillar of this entire negotiations is the fact that it wants to have its own set of data privacy and protection laws and frameworks that will be completely independent of the standards that the United States set for them. The basic part of this is the data localization that the United States is always against in bilateral agreements in many cases. So which India is not very keen on following with the US standards. So in these cases, you definitely have issues coming up already. There are obviously, and this fact that this will be completely shut out of any kind of public consultation shows that there is a problematic thing that is going on already. We obviously spoke about RCEP and other similar sort of multilateral agreements and the problems with that. This is a bigger problem if you look at the kind of issues that they will be talking about in the long run.
Yeah. So, Anish, I mean, can you talk a little bit about the possible or potential trade benefits from this particular deal?
It is kind of, as I said, like because the data about the negotiations are kind of opaque. There is obviously going to be issues in understanding or gauging exactly what kind of supposed benefits can be accrued by, especially considering the fact that there are massive emerging economies like India, Indonesia, and so on, which will be part of this entire agreement or framework that they're negotiating right now. So for them, it is going, free trade deals have often had, very adverse impact in the past. There is an entire history, especially with India, when we talk about how their markets are not necessarily as competitive to international competition in several cases, including in basic agricultural commodities. This can have long-term impact. So we need to really be very wary of how these kind of this agreement or any kind of framework that can have binding, conditions can actually impact many of these countries like Vietnam, India, Indonesia, and so on. Where, especially in an agreement that includes powerful, well developed economies like the Australia and the United States, especially. So, considering the fact that this is an entire framework is being, anchored by the United States in a bid to unseat China's influence in the region, and almost all the countries in this negotiation right now has China as its largest trading partner, is the biggest irony.
Right.
But this whole process of trying to unseat China's influence is obviously going to have its own set of problems, because in many of these cases, it will be much better if these countries had more bilateral set of negotiations and frameworks rather than a binding multilateral, completely opaque process to begin with. So history has not always been very kind in such instances. We need to really be very wary of how things will move forward from now on with this agreement.
Thanks, Anish, for that update. Thanks for joining us. And that's all we have for you today. Thank you for watching Daily Debrief. We look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. You will find more such stories on our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.